Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
SciFi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Keith, and I am your host for today, this Sunday. It is a beautiful day. The weather around here has been impeccable. If you live in Northern California, then you know what I'm talking about. But if you're in another part of the country, it might already be freezing or even snowing. And I really feel for you. But, you know, we're paying for it. California is kind of crazy. We all know that. I think the United States talks about California quite a lot, which is funny because, you know, living here, you kind of just get used to it. You assume that there's just like something kind of normal about the way that everything goes. But to everybody else, they're like, wait, hold up, what now? So, definitely interesting. But, yeah, I think, where were we at last time that I talked with you guys? I know that we're in The Rise of Endymion. I think the last chapter that we ended on was probably like 3 or 4, maybe 5. I'm trying to go through as many chapters as I possibly can with each of these episodes so that we can get through this pretty quickly. Since we are just marathoning it, as in like all of the episodes for the foreseeable future until this is done are going to be on this book. So I hope that you like it, and I hope that you're reading it with me. I've said a bunch of times that I think that it is a really, really good book, and that it is definitely worthy of your time and investment. So we're going to get back into things. And we'll start off, we're kind of in like 2 different sections right now. One is focusing, well, kind of 3. We've got sections that are focusing on the story of Endymion, Raul Endymion, as he travels around the galaxy trying to get back to the ship, the console ship that they originally left Hyperion in. And then we've got Father Captain DeSoya, who is has been called back up to military service. And then we have these chapters that are on, it's not Sakamoto, Ishimoto? I can't remember his name. It ends with Moto. So he is the leader of the Pax Mercantilis, which is basically a privatized company that exists as like an intelligence/trading company. I don't know exactly what I would compare it to. His character seems like it's going to kind of take the Maina Gladstone role that was in The Fall of Hyperion, and his chapters seem to be very much related to the act of gathering intelligence regarding what it is exactly that the Technocore is up to, and that is pretty important because we as readers kind of are getting the impression that the majority of this story is going to rely on what it is that the Technocore is up to, because they've been the ones who have been we found out that they're the ones who are actually hunting Ania. They're the ones who are actually running the church, and they're the ones who are, well, they were manipulating the Farcaster portals. Now the Farcaster portals are being manipulated by Ania's lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. Which, you know, I've mentioned several times all of the references that Dan Simmons uses. I think the reference of The Wizard of Oz is a particularly good one, just because it's such a relatable, like, hero's narrative. in the similar way that, like, Star Wars is kind of considered to be this relatable heroes narrative. Though I do think it's interesting that Simmons hasn't referenced any other science fiction franchises or even implicated their existence in any of these books, because he's constantly making references to, like, these pop culture things or, like, these works of art that he thinks are important. And I'm curious as to why he hasn't implicated that certain things were invented because of their presence in science fiction novels. I'm also surprised he hasn't referenced his own book, especially considering I think The Rise of Endymion came out more than a few years after Hyperion, and I know that it received a fair amount of critical acclaim then, so I wouldn't be surprised to see it referenced at some point. But I think that he might be kind of implying that all of Hyperion was written by... And The Fall of Hyperion was written by Martin Silenus and not by him. But who knows? I've also mentioned that I think that. I've also mentioned I think that Simmons most closely relates to Silenus as a character and has kind of, like, put himself a little bit in the boat of Silenus, if you will. Specifically, well, probably in part because, like, Simmons probably feels old and kind of outdated, but also kind of like the inability to understand, like, what success would look like and whether or not he would even want it, and then talking about what publishers have done to his work in the past. And Simmons is a pretty prolific author. I don't know that I'll read anything else that he's written after this. I might give it a shot, but I did love this series so much that I would be nervous to listen to or read something else that he wrote on the off chance that it ruins my perception of this particular series of works, because they're just so good. So we're going to go into Endymion's story first. He is kind of like, I don't know, as far as I'm concerned, he's the main character of all these novels since they're named after him, in the same way that, like, Hyperion was kind of oddly the main character in The Fall of Hyperion and Hyperion, because everything was centered around it. It seems as if almost everything is centered around Endymion. Even though Father Captain DeSoya is hunting Aeneas, it's been Rawl this entire time that he's basically had the majority of contact with or interaction with, even indirectly. So I think that it's kind of important to, remember that. And I think that that might be part of the manipulation of perception that Dan Simmons is going for in the stylistic choices that he's making in this particular book. But we'll find out. So Endymion has officially left Earth. He farcasted to Lussus. And we were talking about that last week. And when he farcasts away from Lussus, he arrives on another planet with a super complicated name that I'm never going to remember. It's some moon on some planet, and the moon is habitable, but the planet is not. And the moon is not a desirable place to live, but the Pax are there for some reason. And when he arrives, at first everything seems hunky-dory. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he starts to experience this, like, incredible pain that he says is more painful than anything he's ever experienced in his entire life. And he doesn't know what it is. At first, I thought for sure it was going to be, like, a difference in gravity because the pain was centered in his back. And I've never experienced the thing that he's experiencing, so I had no idea. But I thought that it was going to be something along the lines of, like, like a gravity sickness because the compression of his discs was alternating, and because obviously the gravity on the moon is going to be substantially less than the gravity on a planet. Well, maybe not obviously, but most likely, because most moons are much smaller than planets. Though I think there are moons of Jupiter that are as large as Earth, but you'd have to fact check me on that one. But though I wonder if they're round. I wonder if flat earthers think every planet is flat. Or if there are even other planets. Man. Regardless, I think I was thinking that it was going to be some sort of gravity associated sickness, and because he gets out onto land in order to, well, he starts to feel the pain, and then he basically has to get out onto land because there's no way that the pain will stop, and he doesn't know what's happening to him, and he feels like he's dying. And he asks the commlog what's going on, and the commlog's like, well, you're going into shock, and I don't know why. And the guy's like, what do you mean you don't know why? You're like a commlog. Like, you have some, like, little bit of intelligence. Like, what's the deal? And nobody can figure out what's going on with him. So he's just sitting there writhing in pain, and, like, all these random little passerbys are just walking by him. And we basically are told that eventually this woman stops and helps Rawl, and she says that there's no doctors here except for PAX doctors. And Rawl explicitly says, like, no, I don't want a PAX doctor. I can't see a PAX doctor. But this woman doesn't listen to him because he's in so much pain. And we find out that Rawl just has kidney stones, which was very anticlimactic for me because I thought it was going to be some interesting thing. And it's just like, he hasn't been drinking enough water this entire time. And then I went and drank some water because I didn't want kidney stones. And also, I don't know, I was kind of surprised. I like the way that Dan Simmons uses language to try to make you think that this, like, really obscure, elaborate illness is affecting him. And really, it's just like, you haven't been drinking enough water for about 4 years, idiot. So I thought that was interesting. But the doctor, when she gives him the Ultramorph, which is basically like morphine on steroids, apparently puts some truth serum in it. And oddly enough, hears everything that he's saying and just thinks that he's crazy, which I think is hilarious, because he says, like, I'm from Hyperion. I was traveling with, or no, he didn't say who he was traveling with. He just said he came from Hyperion, and then he ended up on Old Earth and came through the Farcaster portal. And she just does not believe a word of what he's saying. And it's really interesting that she doesn't believe a word of what he's saying. And the doctor basically says, you know, I think that you found a way to lie to me despite the truth serum, and I'm going to come back. The only reason that I'm even here is because of the war games that are going on, and once the war games are done, then we'll come pick you up and interrogate you and figure out what's going on with you. But if you disappear or cause any problems, you're just going to make it worse for yourself because we will find you. And so Rawl is also in so much pain he doesn't really have much of a choice. He just has to drink water and hope that the kidney stone passes. And I wouldn't be surprised if these chapters are just an excuse for Simmons to kind of educate us a little bit more about Rawl and also tell about his own experience with kidney stones. I don't know. I'd have to look up and see if he actually has ever had them, but I wouldn't be surprised. I feel like people who have had kidney stones, they frequently talk to me about having had kidney stones. It definitely is not a fun experience, and I would not wish it on anybody, from the descriptions that both Simmons has given here and that other individuals have given me. So, yeah, definitely not a fun experience. But in the universe that Rawl is in, or the planet that Rawl is on, the individuals on that planet all dress in a very unique and interesting way. They have these, like, very bright colors, colored robes, and despite the fact that the gravity is lessened here, they still kind of have a similar body shape to Lucian's, which I think Rawl finds interesting. And I thought for sure that Simmons was going to give us an explanation as to why that was, because it seems like Simmons kind of likes to dispel myths around certain scientific ideas of his time, but didn't get any descriptions as to why that might be the case. So that's not necessarily here or there. But we find out that Rawl is staying with a polyamorous couple, I guess is the best way to phrase it. It's one male and two females who are all together, and I don't remember what he called it. Maybe it was like a triple or a triplet, or I don't remember exactly. But apparently this particular type of relationship is not all that uncommon on the planet, according to them. But the kind of important reason that I'm mentioning this is that the ideas of this society are based off of the ideas of a specific philosopher who I'm pretty sure has a work that we could look up, but I don't remember his name. It's another French guy. Dan Simmons seems to love throwing in obscure references, especially for French authors, into his work. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what makes these people interesting right after this first commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Talk more about things that are important in the rise of Endymion. Right before the break, I was kind of talking about the society in which Rawl Endymion has found himself. It's on some random moon in some random place in the galaxy where the river Tethys has kind of, I guess, put him? Question mark. Not totally sure exactly how I want to describe the journey that Rawl goes on throughout all of this, because it feels as if there's a substantial portion of it that's kind of like being pretty heavily influenced by external factors, because it doesn't seem as if anything that happens to him is random. So, not entirely sure. But the basics of the society are that they kind of follow these very specific philosophic beliefs that are based off of this epic philosophy poem from some time period that wasn't specified in the book. But part of the reason that this is important is because the majority of these people who live in this place are not of the cross, if you will. They are not members of the Pax. And the Pax, it has a presence on this moon, but because the locals/natives don't really have much of an interest, supposedly, in joining the church, the Pax doesn't really service them. The Pax kind of denies access to anyone to the resources of the church if you're not a member of the church. So if you're not a member of the church, then their doctors won't help you. They'll help you, but they won't take you into their hospitals, type of a thing. And if you're not a member of the church, you won't receive protection from their military forces, etc., etc. So the church kind of holds the religious beliefs of individuals hostage in a certain way that I think is interesting. And this comes into play pretty heavily when Endymion starts to get to know the person or the people who rescued him from just kind of writhing in pain on the on the dock next to the river. And basically what he finds out is that this couple or this throuple, I don't know, it's not a throuple because a throuple is three couples if I remember correctly, but it's basically, like I said, it's a polyamorous relationship between a man and two women, and he finds out that one of those women has born a child with the man, and that child is currently suffering from cancer, and there is not a doctor available to them who isn't a Pax doctor who can cure that cancer, and they are currently in conflict about whether or not they ought to save their child's life by giving him the cruciform. But the problem is that the church won't just accept the child to get the cruciform. They expect the whole family to get the cruciform. And in addition, But in addition to access to medical care, there are a number of other resources that would otherwise be unavailable to these people if they didn't have the cruciform and didn't declare belief in Jesus. There are education opportunities, there are access to certain resources and grants and funds that are mentioned specifically that can only be given to individuals who are a member of the church. But the catch is that by becoming a member of the church, you have to follow the church's rules. And the church doesn't support same-sex marriages or polyamorous marriages, which is what these people are participating in. Because the women are married to each other, and then they're both married to the man as well. So it's 3 married people. And clearly the Catholic Church is, even in this universe, not okay with that as something that you would practice regularly. They would view that as like a sin, which is, we don't need to get into that. This isn't that type of podcast. Needless to say, I think I don't think that there's necessarily as much support for that idea as we might think. But my biggest point is that the PACs are basically wielding this power of access to resources over the individual's personal beliefs in a way that is like predatory and manipulative in some capacities. But what's interesting is that the individuals who are being preyed upon and being told that they have to get the cruciform in order to get medical care for their child, those individuals don't view it as predatory. They just say, like, oh, we understand, like, the PACs are the ones who control this resource, and it makes sense that they would want to control it in this specific way. And so we're not necessarily upset by the fact that they're denying us access to the resource, which, I don't know, is interesting. And then the woman starts talking about how it is that the PACs are affecting their way of life. Because the philosophy that they all follow is kind of like a communistic philosophy. Not in the sense that the economic system is communist, but in the sense that it only works if everybody in the area is a participant within it. I think that it probably has something to do with like the idea of a collective consciousness or a collective energy contributing to like a whole in some capacity. Because that seems to be something that Dan Simmons brings up frequently as an idea. That there is some sort of power, some intangible power, like good power within the idea or within the unification of a collective community. And I think that part of the reason that Simmons is like saying this is to kind of, he's saying this because it reflects what it is that he claims created the ultimate intelligence or the God of humanity, right? His implication earlier on in the novels is that the God of humanity does exist and that it is brought into existence by the power of the collective consciousness of humanity in believing in that God. And in a similar fashion, I think that the philosophy of this group brings into existence the well-being of the group through the power of the collective consciousness of those individuals, and that's part of why they act the way that they do. They have a very like individualistic society where individual needs and desires are not viewed as being negative, and people get to benefit from the pursuit of their own individual desires. Being in a polyamorous relationship is a great example of that. And so when Rawl finds out that they're all considering accepting the cruciform in the name of saving their son, he finds out from the male counterpart in this marriage that they're basically going to have to break up their entire family to do this. And the woman, one of the women, who I believe is probably the mother of this boy, states that she is excited about it, and that her partner is excited about it because her partner gets to go study at a school because of their potential joining of the PACs, or if they do join the PACs. But the and that even if the boy dies after receiving the cruciform, because the cruciform apparently can heal some diseases as soon as it becomes, a part of your body, even if he dies of the cancer, he'll come back again, and they'll get to be together in that next iteration of him. It doesn't really seem to be as important to her that they accept the cruciform, or that their family is going to be broken up. She seems to be much more focused on the resurrection of this child. And what I kind of noticed immediately is that this story is very similar to is very similar to the story that Captain Father DeSoya described his family was stuck in. They were a family that was on some random outskirt planet, and his brother was dying, and his family was forced to accept the cruciform, even though I think they called themselves Jesuits or something like that. I can't remember exactly what denomination they were. They were Christian, but they didn't want to follow the pacts, and they felt that the sacrament of the cruciform was not a real sacrament, which, I would agree with. But hey, neither here nor there. And I don't think that we're supposed to agree with it. I think that we are supposed to actively not agree with the way that the Pax is handling the cruciform. But his family was forced into accepting the cruciform in some regard, and even in that enforcement of accepting the cruciform, they still lost DeSoya's brother, because his brother died before they could give him a cruciform. So his brother died the true death. And so, which I think it's interesting that the Pecora call it the true death, and so does the church. I wonder if that's going to have any impact later on. I'm really interested to figure that out. But regardless, I think that it's interesting that DeSoya experiences this thing personally in his own family, and now we have this kind of repetition of it occurring in Rawls' journey. And in the previous book, it is mentioned by Rawl that eventually he and DeSoya, that he would know everything that DeSoya would do. And so I am curious as to how it is that the relationship between Rawl and DeSoya is going to develop throughout these novels, because it's clear that they're not done interacting with each other. There is going to be some, obviously DeSoya's military service is more focused on eliminating ousters currently, which we'll get to that. That's a whole nother thing. But he isn't being tasked with hunting down Ania anymore, but there's still an indication that he's going to be heavily involved in the overall narrative of Rawls' story, because obviously we're still hearing chapters about him, and this book is being written by Rawl, supposedly. But in addition to that, Rawl mentions that he gets to know DeSoya in a way that he is able to understand everything that DeSoya does and is able to predict everything that DeSoya will do. So I am very much interested to figure out and see exactly how it is that comes about, but I'm not really sure how that's going to happen. So that's kind of where we leave off as far as Rawl is concerned. He's still trying to pass these kidney stones. There is a guard at the house that he's in, so he is in kind of a conundrum yet again, which I think is funny that he seems to be the one who's always getting into conundrums. And he specifically at the end acknowledges that he's always getting into conundrums and talks about how before he left, Silenus said something about how, gave a toast about heroes. And Rawl is thinking to himself, there's no way that I'm a hero because I keep getting myself caught in these stupid situations and either almost dying or getting captured or experiencing something like a kidney stone at the most inopportune time. And I think that it's just really funny that Simmons is kind of tongue-in-cheek making fun of the fact that his protagonist doesn't think that he's really the protagonist, even though the protagonist is the one writing the book. There's just multiple levels of comedy here. So That about does it for Endymion. We're going to talk about DeSoya as well as the Pax Mercantilis right after this quick commercial break. Not necessarily in that order. Well, the commercial break's coming first.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, and we are back yet again with more about the rise of Endymion. Right before the break, kind of just finished talking about Rawl and where he's at, what he's up to, the adventures of Rawl and Endymion. He generally is just kind of traveling around and is currently in yet another predicament. So the next person that we're going to talk about, or the next section of story that we're going to talk about, are the Pax Mercantilis. And the Pax Mercantilis, I think, were introduced in the last episode that I did, which was the first few chapters. If you remember correctly, they are a group of intelligence-gathering individuals who currently have knowledge of the Pax and what is going on with them. And I believe that they have another member. The one that we've heard a lot from is Ishimoto, and he has full knowledge of what's going on with the Pax and the Techno Core. And what we find out is that he is kind of trying to figure out what it is that the Techno Core is trying to accomplish with the use of the cruciforms as well as a couple other things. Specifically like why the Pope is going out and killing all of the ousters in some sort of crusade effort, and a couple other things just to try and figure out exactly what's going on. And in an attempt to do this, he has decided that he is going to he isn't going to. He is currently in this spaceship that has flown out into the middle of space, right next to an asteroid, and the asteroid, actually, knowing what I know now, I'm pretty sure I know exactly what's happening here. He has an informant who is going to give him some knowledge of some things, and that knowledge is going to be helpful in some capacity, would be my guess. Not totally sure just yet, but the contact wouldn't go anywhere near Pax-occupied space, and they had to get like a private vessel that no one had ever seen before and fly it out and sneak it past Pax military forces and all this other stuff to jump all through these hoops. And they get there, and basically the primitive ship AI says, "There's nothing out here, dude." And then they hear a knock on the airlock. Well, at first, I think that we as readers are supposed to be really surprised. But then later on, as we're reading about what's going on with DeSoya, we find out that there are actually ousters who have modified themselves or modified their bodies to be able to survive in the total vacuum of space. And they specifically call themselves angels because they have kind of like these wing-like constructs that allow them to kind of like fly or direct themselves through space. And they're very pale and thin because there's no gravity involved in their existence most of the time. And they can handle radiation, So I don't know how the pale. I don't know if they mentioned specifically that they're pale. I think I'm just thinking that they're pale because they call themselves angels, but they can handle hard radiation, the hard radiation of space, without dying. So my guess is that the informant that Ishimoto is meeting up with is an ouster. And that is relatively interesting because of what it is DeSoya is currently up to. But we'll get to that after I talk about another person who is kind of on the inside with the Pax right now. Now, we remember the Grand Inquisitor who was interrogating Corporal Key. And we kind of view that person as being, like, villainous in a very specific regard because they're messing with somebody who we kind of were endeared to because of his actions on God's Grove in relation to saving Ania from the Radamanth Nemes character. And Corporal Key is the only other guy who was conscious and participated in shooting the giant laser at Radamanth Nemes. And he's been put in this like kind of perpetual suspended type existence where he is like not allowed to really do anything. And that's kind of an understatement, if I'm being honest. Like he's basically put into a coma, brought up, questioned, tortured, put back into a coma. He's not even being killed and then resurrected, which would, I don't know if that'd be better or worse. But regardless, we kind of think of the Grand Inquisitor as like a bad guy, but in some capacities, this next chapter that we get with him as the main focus, he's not exactly as much of the bad guy as we would think that he is. So we kind of get like in this chapter, we get a basic understanding of why it is that the church is kind of doing what they're doing as far as the ousters are concerned. They have decided that they're going to go out and eliminate the ousters because the ousters have committed some sort of atrocity by deciding to alter their bodies with like different genetic therapies and mutations and things like that in order to be better adapted for space. And I guess is also that they refuse to accept the cruciform in some capacity. Now, part of what confuses me about all this is that the ousters have kind of constantly been this very like ethereal Kingdom of Narnia type entity throughout these books. Like even I think the leader is mentioned as having aspects of a lion. And if I'm looking at everything else that Dan Simmons does in this book, I wouldn't be surprised to see a reference to C.S. Lewis, as C.S. Lewis is kind of like, he's thought of as being a pretty good fantasy author. He is kind of ubiquitous in those circles of writers. And his story is kind of a children's story. And it seems that if we're not talking about philosophy, we're talking about things that children could like as far as Dan Simmons is concerned. Wizard of Oz is a great example. It is very much kind of a children's tale, a children's story. And I think that part of the reason that Simmons does that is that, and this is part of, I don't know, this is just a hypothesis that I kind of have, I think that ultimately the ousters are going to be the thing that evolves into God. And I think that specifically the fact that the ousters call these people who can fly in space angels, and they have similar aspects to angels, makes me kind of think that part of the human evolution is to become adapted to everything. And I think that, like, as I've mentioned before, the ideas of Zen are very prevalent in these novels, especially like Zen Buddhism, and also in a lot of religions and a lot of a lot of interpretations of religion. Ultimately, it is humans that become the God. And if a human is the thing that becomes God or gains godlike aspects, then ultimately, because they've gained that, they can now exist outside of time, which means that their existence becomes this kind of like cyclical thing that is constantly occurring in conjunction with the imperfect form of itself at all times. And I would not be surprised at all to see Simmons kind of turn this thing on its head at the end of it and be like, yeah, ultimately humans were the thing that became God, and there's no way to stop it. And that's what the Technocore was trying to stop, is humans from becoming God by killing the ousters, because the ousters are evolving at a fast pace towards this eventual like singularity, quote unquote, of God. And the reason that I'm saying all of this is because I think that Simmons is going to indicate that there were certain individuals throughout time who were able to kind of peek into the future in some regard. Because when he talks about Ania, he talks about Ania as remembering the future. As in, she has access to it at all times, but can't necessarily interact with it and doesn't know that it will come to fruition. She could have seen something that she was doing and have no idea that she's going to do that because she doesn't remember it. And so I think in a similar way, Simmons is going to make the argument that there is this access of creative individuals to this special type of existence that we otherwise don't, or that normal people, quote unquote, otherwise don't have access to. And that these people who are writing about these fantastic things have some sort of interaction with things of the metasphere or the megasphere. And that's going to be part of like the conclusion of the philosophy that he draws from these stories and these characters. So I think that if he is going to incorporate C.S. Lewis into this in some regard, or Narnia in some regard, it's going to be through the form of like the ousters, who kind of are these anthropomorphic creatures that have taken on aspects of other living things within the universe in their attempt to adapt, but in doing so will have accidentally like increased their oneness with the rest of creation in some regard. And again, as I mentioned before in the podcast, I think that the idea of oneness, the idea of unification, is something that Simmons is very attached to. I think that it's part of his own religious beliefs in some capacity, that he thinks that there is like this specialness to the oneness that individuals experience throughout their lifetime through different things, different interactions, and that oneness is ultimately what creates things. Because, and then this is kind of getting into a little bit more like abstract philosophy, but the idea of a tree being a tree is because all of us have agreed upon it being a tree, and that's part of what makes it a tree. It's not that the word tree or even the thing tree in itself exists as anything outside of what existence we as a collective group have decided to give it. And so in doing that, we have created something. And I think that what Simmons is going to make the argument about is that this kind of is what brings concepts into reality, specifically the concept of God, is the oneness, the unification of all thinking of a thing as being a specific thing, and that ultimately is what creates that thing. And so in the pursuit of survival, the ousters have adapted their bodies using like a close alignment with or an adoption of other animals' physical traits and characteristics, and in doing so, they've accidentally increased their alignment with the rest of creation. Because I think that part of what Simmons is going to argue in these books is that all of creation exists in this like profound, singularly driven entity towards a certain result or goal, and in pursuing that result and goal, you kind of create the final result. And so the final result solicits or is necessitated by itself. And so it's kind of this big cyclical thing that is happening in very similar fashion to how history happened in the past, and how history is repeating itself in the form of different occurrences within Simmons' novels, this whole series. Because if you look at almost every like military thing that Cassad brings up, almost all of the books that are brought up, everything is referenced in regard or in reference to something else that came before it. And so it's kind of just this constant cycle of recurring things that I don't think that we're supposed to think of it as negatively as like we maybe are thinking of it as being, if that makes sense. I think that Simmons' intent is for us to realize that, you know, these cycles are all just a part of the reality in which we live, and that we shouldn't necessarily be deterred from, acknowledging their existence in the way that we normally would be. So that's about all we've got as far as those two chapters are concerned, and maybe a little bit of prediction. So we're going to finish off the podcast by talking about what's going on with Father Captain DeSoya, and that'll be right after this last commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. That was our last commercial break for the day. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is what is going on with Captain Father DeSoya, as well as might hit on the Inquisitor again real quick, just because there was a detail that I forgot to mention. The Shrike is currently loose, which is interesting because generally we think of the Shrike as being confined specifically to like Hyperion, but there's been an appearance of the Shrike on the planet of Mars, which is the planet that Kassad is from. So I'm actually kind of suspicious that Kassad didn't defeat the Shrike, but maybe became the Shrike in some way. Kind of like it's kind of like the Terminator timeline, where like the person had to beget or had to make himself exist in a weird way. I think that's how that timeline goes. I'm not necessarily super familiar with those films, but I know that they're really good. I've heard really good things. But generally, the fact that they're going back to Old Earth system, the Inquisition is, as well as gosh darn it, what is that cardinal's name? I can never remember. Very large guy. Anyway, so that's what's going on there. So the Shrike is loose, so that's part of the reason why we're getting these chapters on the Inquisitors, because they're interacting with the Shrike, and I think that Simmons wants us to know that that's important in some regard. So we've got that going on. As far as Captain Father DeSoya is concerned, he's brought back to active duty, and I mentioned last week that he was looking for Corporal Key, unable to find him. We know where he is, unfortunately, or fortunately that we know where he is, but we're not happy about where he is, I think would be the best way to phrase it. But regardless, DeSoya has been sent out on a new mission associated with the crusades that they are doing in outer space. And oddly enough, they're going surprisingly well. Well, I mean, if well is that Father Captain DeSoya and his crew are absolutely massacring hundreds of thousands of ousters at a time. There is, we kind of go straight from DeSoya getting assigned and getting Father Gregorius to join him to the battle, I guess, if you want to call it that. It's not really much of a battle. DeSoya he's just kind of going over the miscellaneous orders that he's fulfilled in his process after he gets past the, they call it the Great Wall, but it's basically like the division between where the ousters have occupied space and the Pax have occupied space. And so after they get past that divider, things accelerate pretty quickly, would be the best way to phrase it. DeSoya and his crew basically, they just start wiping out miscellaneous colonies of ousters, and there are colonies that are in like well-known places, and they're killing tens and tens of thousands of these ousters. And this is the first glimpse that we get as to like the military capabilities that ousters have in comparison to the new Archangel type or the new Archangel class ships. And I actually learned something interesting about archangels. Apparently, in the Jewish tradition, a lot of the archangels are associated with specific miracles or specific acts in the world. And I found out that that Raphael, the angel Raphael, is associated with miraculous healing. And so I think it's kind of ironic that the ship that has been hunting down Aeneas and the ship that Desoya is on is named after the angel that is associated with miraculous healing, because like Desoya didn't have that miraculous healing in his childhood, or he wouldn't be in the Pax. He's in the Pax because of what happened to his brother and the fact that his brother couldn't be saved by the cruciform or by doctors. And in a similar fashion, Rawl, Endymion, is also in a place where he is in need of, well, the family that he's with is in need of a healing miracle. So I think it's interesting that there is this association. I don't know if Simmons did it intentionally. It could be happenstantial. That's one of the great and weird things about like a lot of good art, is that part of the reason that it's good is because it comes from this like place of sincerity, or this odd, I guess, instinct you could call it, that a lot of artists have to be able to create associations with things that otherwise wouldn't be associated with each other, which is good. Well, obviously it's good. It's interesting because it's hard to know, when we're talking about the interpretation of literature and the interpretation of art in general, there's always a conversation of like, well, how intentional was this thing that the author or artist did? Like, did they know that this color was associated with this thing in this place? Or is there just like this confirmation bias that we as a species have because of these certain interactions? And I just find all of that hypothesizing to be incredibly fascinating. And I really enjoy looking into it, I guess, for lack of another term. I have loved all of the deep allusions and everything throughout this book, and I've mentioned it more than once that I think that Simmons is doing a lot of this intentionally, but I wouldn't be surprised if something like the Raphael being named the Raphael was just like his random association with or his random knowledge of archangels in whatever mythology it is that he's trying to reference, and then it just so happens that afterwards I, as a reader, can find meaning in the symbolism or the associations that those things have within their original mythos. And it could just be accidental that Simmons is able to kind of leverage that. So I thought that was an interesting point worth noting. But the last battle description that we get as we're getting towards the end of the chapters on Desoya, before Simmons transitions back to the investigation of the Shrike appearance on Mars, is that they're in some system and they've come across this asteroid, and it's basically, they say it's shaped like a potato, which I think is interesting. I'm sure that there's something there, but I don't know off the top of my head what exactly that is. But they figure out that it's called a birthing asteroid. So it's where the Ousters house, and I guess, I don't know, they don't just say whether or not Ousters have children in the like organic way that humans have children. The Ousters are humans, ultimately, and that's part of what the purpose of this chapter is to show us that there's some questioning of like the depiction of Ousters by the Pax, by Father Gregorius, but we'll get there. I think that there might be some potential that this is kind of like a Brave New World situation where it's like a birthing pod where they've got a bunch of like cloning vats, I guess, for lack of another word, or something along those lines, but they don't really say. So they kind of go into detail about the battle, and they talk about how there's all these Ousters who are the space angels that I've mentioned before, adapted to vacuum, who try to fly towards the ship, and they just get literally roasted alive by the lasers on the ship. the archangel that they're on, I don't know if it's still the Raphael. It might be the Michelangelo, I think is what Simmons is calling it. All of the archangels are named after archangels. So there's a Lucifer, there's a couple other ones. And what's interesting is that all of the ouster colonies are named after like different aspects of Christian faith too. Like there's a Beelzebub one that they call, or Beelzebub colony, and I don't know if that's the Ousters calling it that or if it's the Pax calling it that. It could really go either way, but generally it's pretty obvious that like the references to biblical mythology and biblical battles in the spiritual realm is pretty heavy. I am interested to know if Simmons is potentially Jewish or Catholic. I might have to Google that at some point so that I can talk about it, but generally speaking, the amount of knowledge that he has and the way that he talks about things indicates to me that he's at least knowledgeable about those things, and not just in the sense that he did research for the book, but in the sense that he like is actually personally knowledgeable about those things, which I think is part of what adds to the high quality literature that we're getting out of this book. So we get to see kind of the Space Angels in action. They talk about their wings, and then after the battle is over, Gregorius comes back and is giving confession to DeSoya. And during this process, Gregorius is kind of beginning to question what it is that they're doing. And he's asking for forgiveness from something, like he doesn't really know what he's asking for forgiveness from, because, as DeSoya says, you were following orders. You don't have to worry about anything. You didn't do anything wrong. But what Gregorius tells him is that as they were inside of this asteroid, they did see some ousters who had genetically modified themselves to the point where they didn't even seem to be human any longer. But when they went into the nurseries, he talks about how the babies look just like human babies, because ousters are humans, and they start out looking just like humans. And he talks about how they're supposed to kill everybody. That's what the Catholic Church has said, right? The Pax has told him, kill literally every man, woman, and child. And so he talks about setting off grenades in these nurseries, and how the incubators are sealed off from the vacuum and the radiation, because these children aren't modified yet to handle it. And the interior of the asteroid is very sparse as far as luxuries are concerned. Like, the ousters that are in there aren't the angels that are adapted to space vacuum by any means, but they're also not adapted to space vacuum. So a lot of them die when Gregorius and his team open up the airlocks. And then he talks about how the mothers of those children fought like literally with tooth and nail against these guys in the super advanced combat armor and stuff like that. And he talks about how the babies are getting burned alive inside of these incubators, and he's talking about how much it like wrecked him as an individual, and how he's starting to kind of question what it is that they're doing, because to him it doesn't seem as if those babies are innocent in some way. And I do think that this is a direct reference to another work that has to do with the Crusades, but I don't know off the top of my head. I know that like 90% of what it is that Simmons likes to write about is the cyclical aspect of history and the way that it repeats itself, sometimes even verbatim. I think that is a big part of the premise of this book, is that ultimately like things may look different technologically, but humans are still the same type of thing, continuing to make the same type of mistakes and encroachments on the rest of creation. And that the ousters are the only ones who have potentially evolved past that, but we are actively looking to, or at least humanity as in general is actively looking to destroy them in an absolute way. In the same way that humanity kind of was looking to destroy, or not the same way that humanity was looking to destroy, but the same way that the Technocore was looking to destroy humanity. So Gregorius finishes his confession, and they begin the jump to the next place, and Captain DeSoya tells him to say Hail Marys for questioning his orders, even though I know that Captain DeSoya agrees with him. I think that it's pretty evident based on DeSoya's actions that he is profoundly aware of something being wrong in the Pax, and doesn't know exactly what to do because he can't exactly stop following orders. So I am really interested to see where DeSoya's story goes. I'm also interested to see what's happening with the Shriken being on Mars. I mean, generally, it feels as if this book is going to wrap up a lot of loose ends for us and ultimately give us maybe an ending that we can be semi-satisfied with. So that's all I've got for you guys this week. We'll be talking more about this on Wednesday. So I guess we will see you Wednesday. Thanks for joining me. Make sure you check out any of the other GSMC podcasts that you might be interested in. And that's all I got for you. Have a great day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.